Hi, I'm Terry Cook. You're watching Hamilton's Vital Signs, and we are back again to talk about stuff that matters in Hamilton. This month, we're going to talk about our Vital Signs report, which is an annual report card of quality of life and some social determinants of health and educational outcomes that's done both here in Hamilton by our community foundation and now around the world. Many Canadian foundations, but also foundations in the UK and other parts of the world have participated. And this year, we focused on the economy locally, and I'm really pleased to have with us two of our key partners in that work. Sara Mayo, who is a social planner with the Hamilton Social Planning and Research Council. Sara, you were the author of the report, and I think better than anybody understand what's happening in the local economy and can speak to this report. And Howard Elliott, the managing editor of the Hamilton Spectator, and the Spec have been both our partners in the Vital Signs report since its inception, and also, I think, leading catalysts around poverty in this community for the past decade. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the report, a little bit about your organizations, and then a little bit about your insight into what's happening in Hamilton. And Sara, I'm going to start with you because you've been involved in research in this community and involved in social justice for a long time, and as somebody who has really immersed in the content of the report, I want to ask you what, if anything, surprised you.
I think maybe the thing that surprised me the most was around youth. We know that youth have a hard time in the labor market, but it's to a certain extent a normal process. Every generation of youth always has a hard time entering the labor market because they don't have the experience that older workers have. Mm-hmm. And so I was a bit surprised at the extent that, and I'd heard some economists kind of discount that, oh, this is normal phenomenon, but it really seemed like there is a different thing going on with today's youth. When we found that the employment rate of 15 to 24-year-olds went from about 68% to 53% over the last 20 or so years, that's a big drop. That mm-hmm. means that half of our youth, 15 to 24, many of them are in school, more of them are in school than used to be, but it means that they have less access to summer jobs, to part-time mm-hmm. jobs than they would have in the past, and that's worrying.
And more broadly around it, employment levels, the report speaks a lot to what you define and describe as precarious employment. And what I want to, by the way, I'm supposed to hold this report up so that the folks in the control room can see the beautiful artwork, and suggest that you have a look at our website and delve into the content of this. But talk to us about what precarious employment entails.
So precarious employment has many features, and so some of them are around benefits, access to benefits. So when you're, so it's not just low-wage work or part-time work. It's really about that security and access to benefits. So are you paid when you if you're sick for a day, are you paid if you don't go in? Mm-hmm. Or do you have to go in, or your pay is docked? Do you have access to health care, to extended drug plan, or to pension benefits? And is your schedule fixed, or do you have notice of when schedules are changed, how much notice you have? So those are the kinds of features. When you don't have those things, that's so this work is from Wayne Luchuk at McMaster University and his partners. They define when you don't have those better employment conditions, then they call that insecure work or precarious work.
Very good. The report itself is called Hamilton's Economic Renaissance, a prosperity unevenly shared. And Howard, you wrote what I thought was a very thoughtful editorial in which you cautioned about missing the sharp edges of the Renaissance. And I want you to just talk about what you were trying to get at in that editorial.
I think I was trying to get at the uncomfortable truth about Hamilton's Renaissance, which overall is a wonderful thing, obviously. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But for it to be truly sustainable and for the benefits to be optimized, it has to be accessible, if you like, to as many people as possible. And because of the systemic barriers that we have in place, and in some cases we have allowed to develop, we don't have that. So instead what we've got is a renaissance that is of great benefit to a certain percentage of the population, of reasonable benefit to a percentage of the population, And then it turns nasty for a percentage of the population because of accommodation costs and other factors in precarious employment. So we often hear and celebrate the fact that Hamilton's Renaissance is now so well established. We're not on the cusp of anything. We're already there. I worry a little bit that we may be losing sight of. It's in everyone's interest and everyone needs for that to be applied as broadly as possible, because we will all pay, not just the people who suffer from it immediately, but down the road we will all pay, because even from a financial perspective, it's just bad business when people are left behind.
I want you to step back a little bit, because it so happens that we're sitting here in a week in which the Spec is running a week-long in-depth investigative piece by a number of your writers around your poverty project, which was led, I think, initially by Bill Dunphy, but certainly have had extraordinary contributions over the years by folks like Steve Bust on the Code Red series. And you're doing a bit of a retrospective. And I want to ask, first of all, why is the Spectator even involved at this level? Because as we've discussed before, it certainly isn't about selling more daily copies of newspapers.
I wish. I wish it was that easy. Not that this is easy. It's not. It's the people involved with this series and the original series. It's very heavy lifting, but it's eminently worthwhile. We're involved, as we were involved from the very beginning, because we believe the extent to which systemic poverty continues to be an issue in Hamilton. We have a responsibility to work at doing something about it, and it also happens to be good business to work at doing something about it. So we don't stand on any completely altruistic altar on that. This is our town, this is our city, our families live here, our kids live here, if they can find jobs and they don't have to move, as mine did. So we have a lot invested with Hamilton's sustainable prosperity, which means sooner or later we have to make a bigger dent in systemic poverty than we have so far.
And Sara, the other piece of the poverty puzzle, if you will, that jumps out from your work in this Vital Signs report is the dramatic escalation around challenges faced by people looking for affordable housing. That what was 10 years ago kind of a chronic challenge for Hamilton has become really an emerging crisis. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about what's changed there. In fact, in the midst of this renaissance and some really buoyant economic news, in fact, the housing situation is more precarious than ever.
So I think, you asked about what's the surprise. This was not the surprise. We can tell, as soon as we know, we've seen headlines in the Spec for a long time about rising resale prices of homes on the ownership market, and we know that means that there will be an impact on rental housing. And because there has been no significant increase, in fact, there's been a decrease in the number of private market apartment rental units. There's basically more people competing because fewer people can afford the ownership market, can afford to move from rental to ownership. And so more people are staying as renters, and then new people wanting to get in, so young people especially wanting to get into the rental market, are finding it harder and harder to find a place to live. And the city has allowed the condoization of many rental units, some of whom stay as rentals and are bought by investors, but it still kind of fragments the rental market and makes it more difficult to find units. And so we've seen the vacancy rate drop in 1 year from 4.5% to 1.8%, and then of course, when there's fewer units or more people competing, then the prices go up. And so the prices went up by about 4.1% in 1 year, which was the highest of any major city in Ontario in the last year. So it's very concerning.
Howard, one of the things you do when you're not in your day job at the Spectator is you chair the Hamilton Roundtable on Poverty Reduction. And I know, because I sit with you there, that around the table are many people with lived experience who in fact are facing this exact challenge. And I just wonder about perspectives that you're hearing from the roundtable, and maybe if I can ask you to speak a little bit to some of the things that are important for us to start thinking about some solutions. And if you want, I'll lob a softball at you. There's a new federal government who actually spoke to the need for affordable housing in the course of an election campaign, and who now hold a majority government in Ottawa.
Indeed, and that empty seat at the table on so many issues, the federal seat, now appears that it may be occupied by a government that believes in national strategies and taking a more holistic approach to these problems. That said, this government has also set itself an agenda, a cripplingly ambitious agenda, so the proof will be in the pudding. But I think that obviously the idea of the federal government getting back into the affordable housing game in some way, shape or form, tripartite agreements with the province, the municipality, some kind of incentive-based system to encourage people to invest, developers in affordable housing. At the provincial level, possibly maybe some legislative changes that would mandate in new developments a certain percentage, at least do more of that. The housing thing, I think, is quickly emerging over the next year as, I think you said, an almost crisis. Well, that's not an overstatement at all. I think we're looking at a really serious problem. We're hearing that at the round table. So we have made a determination that we want to be a little bit more involved and try to help in that area with both public awareness and also perhaps lobbying for policy changes at the provincial and the federal level. The thing about affordable housing is that, of course, the municipality is somewhat shackled in how much it can do. It has much less flexibility than the senior governments, and yet it has the lion's share of the responsibility. Very encouraging to hear that Mr. Trudeau says he will be getting back into that game with this government. We'll wait and see. And if he does, then I think that's a very positive step.
On that note, we've got to go to a break. I'm with Howard Elliott from the Hamilton Spectator, Sara Mayo from the Social Planning and Research Council, and we're talking about Hamilton Community Foundation's Vital Signs Report. We'll be right back.
You can never really be ready for the news that it's not an ear infection anymore, that it's cancer.
The Make-A-Wish Foundation gives hope, strength, and joy by granting magical wishes to children with life-threatening medical conditions.
Someone came in from Make-A-Wish Foundation and they told us we were going to get a wish. Annabelle can play soccer and she can do ballet. Everything seems so much bigger and better. Help us make a wish for a happy ending.
For 25 years, you've been helping to make our roads safer by doing the right thing. You've been the designated driver, you've stayed over, called home, you've called a cab or a friend, and planned ahead. Let's keep doing the right thing. Support sober driving by getting yourself and your friends home safely.
Do the right thing.
Visit ArriveAlive.org to find out more. Arrive Alive. Drive sober.
And we're back. I'm Terry Cook. You're watching Hamilton's Vital Signs, and I am with Howard Elliott of the Spectator and Sara Mayo, the Social Planning Council, talking about our Vital Signs report for this year, which was done in partnership with both the Social Planning Council and the Spec. And in particular, Sara, we were talking about both precarious employment and housing. And I want to start with the housing piece of it because Howard mentioned the ability or limited range of municipal governments to respond to an emerging housing crisis in Hamilton. But it strikes me that there's an increasing appetite at the provincial level. Minister McMeekin, in fact, has expressed strong support for a private member's bill around inclusionary zoning. And there seems to be a more proactive will by the city to look at redevelopments in the context of making sure that there's a range of affordability in all neighborhoods.
Yeah, and so it is true that we're seeing kind of good signs. We'll see if it actually turns into action, but we see, so inclusionary zoning would be allowing, the province would allow municipalities to require a certain percentage of units to be affordable, either rental or ownership, and the exact nature of that would be determined by the municipalities. But it's and so if that comes, that will certainly be, the City of Hamilton has been asking for that tool, so it'll be useful if it does come. But the city doesn't have hasn't used the powers that it does have, are more limited, but it hasn't used them to the extent that it could have in the past few years. So there has been, finally we're starting to see more housing units downtown in the lower city and in fact across the city. And the city has not done any kind of negotiation that is done in some other cities like Toronto, where you negotiate around, the amount of parking or the number of floors or various other zoning issues. And you negotiate, the city can negotiate and say, okay, we'll give you this, and in exchange, you have to ensure a certain amount of units are affordable. And so this density bonusing voluntary system hasn't been used very much in Hamilton, and there's a real missed opportunity there. And they could start doing that today. They don't need to wait for the provincial government or federal national housing strategy. Sometimes, those kinds of things can be used as a way of delaying, but really there's things they could do right now.
Yeah, and I have to tell you, as somebody who once wore the hat of an elected official and was occasionally tormented about my support for affordable housing, the other unspoken piece is, of course, the very real concern about not in my backyard. And inevitably, the historic challenge of trying to integrate affordable housing in all neighborhoods, because if we're going to solve this, frankly, it can't just be a let's do it in the North End or in the waterfront. It has to be a much broader-based approach, is the inevitable resistance that you hear from voices in communities that fear a mixture of housing types in the neighborhood. And Howard, your newspaper has covered that periodically over the years. Some of it, I think, is based on a perception of high-density, high-rise social housing projects that were built here and in other communities across North America in the 60s. But how do we get past that piece of embracing the need for people of all income levels to live in all parts of this community?
It's one of the greatest challenges, I think, and I haven't given an awful lot of thought, both at HRPR and at the spec as well. I think ultimately it has to be about changing attitudes. I don't think there's another way to do this. I think we have made some progress at HPR in terms of changing people's attitudes, trying to break down some of the existing stereotypes. That is a long and ongoing challenge. This stuff didn't happen overnight, and it's not going to get fixed overnight. I would love to hear from somebody who thinks there's a better way or another way to do this, but ultimately I think we have to work on the premise that we all benefit by an inclusive community. We benefit financially, we benefit socially, we benefit educationally, we benefit in all sorts of ways, and we don't benefit when we don't have that. So I don't know of any way to succeed at that other than keep telling that story over and over and over again, and hopefully more and more people will start to listen to it.
And the other side of that coin, of course, as Code Red has pointed out, is there's a cost to concentrated poverty in lifespan, in healthcare costs, in poorer educational outcomes. And oftentimes, when we can make that more immediate and understandable to a community, they respond. It's enlightened self-interest, if you would. The other piece of this that I want you to speak to, if you could, Sara, is the notion that where people are working, that there are alternatives, even in the areas where we've seen good news. And the number of young people moving to this community is a good news story because it's a harbinger of talent and opportunity that has chosen Hamilton. But there's some things we can do around employment policy, about incenting employers to think differently about the resources that they have working for them and the rest of their lives that we need to, as a community and as policymakers, to be thinking about. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, well, the HRPR and the Social Planning Council have been working for a few years now on a living wage campaign, which is a voluntary-based system where employers on their own decide that for these good reasons of enlightened self-interest and in fact their bottom line, because there's research that shows that the productivity increases when you pay people a living wage as opposed to sort of a much smaller minimum wage. So those kinds of living wage policies are one tool, and now we see the province is starting to realize, okay, okay, we can't just rely on the goodwill of employers. We're going to have to adapt the labor standards and employment standards to better reflect the reality of the labor market, and not kind of assume that things can go by, that things will go well if we don't regulate them. And so the province right now is undergoing some commission for modernizing the employment standards, and there's good hope that they will do things around scheduling. You know, obviously we're in a society where we're going to always have people needing to work different hours, but the idea is around notice, right? And that people should be able to at least have some not have their schedule be both difficult overnight work and also completely variable, that they have some control over knowing in advance, okay, I'm going to be able to go to my son's soccer class and my daughter's hockey tournament because I know what my schedule is going to be, even though it's different hours at different times, it's at least fixed.
Howard, can you speak to the living wage campaign? Because part of it is throwing down the gauntlet of challenge and asking employers, both public and private sector, to lead. But I think the other part of that equation is, to what extent is that wishful thinking versus the need at some level to regulate, that we treat people in a way that ensures that if they're working hard and contributing, that they should be able to live in dignity and put food on the table?
I think that it, ultimately and eventually, there's going to need to be some kind of a regulatory solution that examines the question of living wage or minimum wage adjustment or something. I mean, we know how much money people need to live a productive and involved life. It's not a secret. It's a fact. We are enthused about the extent to which employers of all stripes in Hamilton have agreed, once they learn about it, and have, in a considerable number, have come aboard and become living wage employers to one degree or another, aspiring to one level or another. I think ultimately we may come to a point where it needs to go further than that, but we have, although we've been working on this for a long time, we have so much further to go and so much more we can do, that I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us before we have to look at that. Ultimately, we may need some kind of a regulatory response to this question, if nothing else works.
Believe it or not, we're winding down in terms of the time available. I guess the takeaway question, open-ended question I'd like to put to both of you, and Sara, we'll start with you, is it strikes me that this is a report with lots of good news and obviously some serious challenge. Talk to me about how you're feeling in terms of the balance of despair versus opportunity, and kind of where we need to go next.
I think that, like you said, you know, growth is generally good. It's better to be, you know, kind of shaping the growth and changing the extent of it and the directions that it goes in than dealing with decline. And I'm especially hopeful because I think attitudes are shifting in Hamilton compared to other cities. I think that we're seeing much less of a NIMBYist attitude towards affordable housing developments than we see in other cities. There's neighborhood associations across the city that want more affordable housing in their neighborhoods.
And are welcoming and trying to understand density, which strikes me as a really good thing.
I think that there's a lot of amazing work being done in neighborhoods, one by one, people educating each other and realizing that, you know what, we all face that risk now, especially with a more insecure labor market. We all face the risk of losing our job tomorrow, and we want to be able to continue living in our neighborhoods even if we can't afford our particular house anymore. That we want and that we want our kids to be able to afford to live in our neighborhoods and not move away. So I think people are more and more open to that on the affordable housing side, and then also, like you say, employers and others, we're seeing a real sort of consensus around this. I think the reaction to this report is nobody's been like, oh, this is ridiculous. People are recognizing that, yeah, this is something we do have to tackle in a better way.
Last 45 seconds to you, Howard. Hope or despair, and where do we go from here?
Oh, I couldn't do the kind of work that HRPR does if I wasn't optimistic about it. Stubbornly optimistic, perhaps. Not ready to give up by any stretch. And I think that has to characterize, as we're seeing it in the poverty series that we're running this week. Progress has been made, yes. We've got some new challenges that we've talked about today. We have a very long way to go, but I don't get any sense from anybody who's working in this area that anybody is thinking about giving up. We need to push on with this and make sure Hamilton that's the best place it can be for all of us.
Fantastic. And on that note, let me thank you both for your participation here today and for the work you're doing in Hamilton on these important issues. Sara Mayo from the Social Planning Council and Howard Elliott from the SPEC. It's been great to be with you. You've been watching Hamilton's Vital Signs. I'm Terry Cook. You can, as always, follow us on Facebook or Twitter, and we hope you'll be back with us next month. Take care.